Grandmaster Solarix. Vorn knelt on the blood-stained floor of the Arena of Honor and looked up at the human who had defeated 400 years of mastery with 37 years of practice. 3 blades lay abandoned on the stone, and crystalline blood dripped from a dozen wounds, and the stump of a severed arm throbbed with pain. That seemed to echo through every fiber of the ancient warrior's being, but it was not the physical wounds that hurt the most. It was the knowledge that everything Solarix had believed about the sword, about combat, about mastery itself, had been wrong. The crowd waited in silence that stretched across the arena like a held breath, and thousands of eyes watched as the greatest blade master in Thalassian history faced a choice between death and surrender. Solarix thought of 4 centuries of victory, of countless opponents who had fallen before these 4 hands, of the pride and glory that had seemed so permanent and so deserved. All of it meant nothing now. "I yield," Solarix said, and the words came out hoarse and broken, but they carried through the silent arena like thunder. The crowd erupted. Thalassian voices rose in outrage and disbelief, and some warriors were already shouting that the duel must have been rigged, that no human could defeat their grandmaster fairly, that this was some trick or deception, that the honor of their people demanded be exposed. But other voices called for silence, and other eyes had seen the truth of what had happened on the arena floor, and those who had truly watched knew that there had been no tricks. The human had simply been better. Ji-hoon lowered his blade and stepped back, giving Solarix space to rise or fall without further threat, and medical attendants rushed onto the fighting floor to tend to the Grandmaster's wounds. In the diplomatic section, Ambassador Yoon Sira was weeping openly now, surrounded by other human staff members who could not quite believe what they had just witnessed. Varath Kel pushed his way through the crowd toward the arena floor, his face twisted with fury that could not find an acceptable target. "This is impossible," Varath shouted. "The human must have cheated. There must be some weapon we did not detect, some poison on the blade." Ji-hoon turned to face the trade lord, who had started all of this with an insult and a torn sash. "Have your people examined my blade?" he said calmly. "Have them examine my body for hidden weapons or technology? Have them review every moment of the duel from every angle. And when they find nothing, you will have your answer." Varath sputtered with rage that could not be released. "I challenge you myself," he declared. "I invoke the right of blades in my own name." Ji-hoon shook his head slowly. "You are welcome to do so," he said. "But consider carefully what you just watched, and ask yourself whether a trade lord who practices the blade as a hobby truly wishes to face someone who has given his life to nothing else." Varath's hand went to his sword hilt and stayed there, trembling, and the trade lord's eyes flickered between the human's calm face and the blood that still stained the arena floor after. A long moment Varath turned and pushed his way back through the crowd without another. Word the duel was over. In the days that followed, the galaxy learned what had happened in the Arena of Honor, and the news spread through every system and station where beings gathered to share stories and wonder at the strange things that happened in the vast darkness between stars. The Thalassians retreated into silence, processing a defeat that challenged everything their civilization believed about itself. And the trade negotiations resumed with a very different balance of power than before. Ambassador Yoon Sira secured terms that were far more favorable than anyone had expected. And when she thanked Ji-hoon for what he had done, he simply bowed and said he was glad to be of service. But the true ending of this story came later, in private, far from the crowds and the politics and the galactic attention. Solarix Vorn came to Ji-hoon's quarters 3 days after the duel, walking slowly because the wounds had not yet fully healed, and knocked on the door with the only primary hand that remained. Ji-hoon opened the door and stepped aside without a word, allowing the defeated Grandmaster to enter. For a long moment they stood in silence, the human and the Thalassian, warrior and warrior. And the weight of what had passed between them filled the small room. I have thought of nothing else since the duel, Solarix finally said. I have reviewed every moment in my memory, and I still cannot understand how you did what you did. Ji-hoon gestured for the Grandmaster to sit, and took a seat himself on the other side of a small table. Ask your questions, Ji-hoon said, and I will answer what I can. Solarix's crystalline eyes held pain and confusion and something else. Something that looked almost like hope. We have practiced the sword for 12,000 years, Solarix said. We have developed 10,000 techniques and trained millions of warriors and built our entire civilization around the blade. And yet you defeated me with one sword and one technique and a mere 43 years of life. The Grandmaster leaned forward with desperate intensity. How is that possible? Ji-hoon was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. Your people spread your mastery across millennia and millions of warriors, he said. You built an ocean of knowledge that stretched in every direction, but was never very deep. He held up his hand with fingers spread. I poured everything into a single point, he continued, closing his hand into a fist. I did not try to learn everything about the sword. I tried to learn one thing completely. And I spent 37 years drilling down into that one thing until I reached a place that your people never knew existed. Solarix shook head slowly. But the techniques, the patterns, the complexity that we have developed over all those centuries, surely that must count for something. It does count for something, Ji-hoon agreed. Your techniques are beautiful and effective and would overwhelm most opponents, but technique is built on foundation. And if the foundation is not deep enough, then all the complexity in the world is just a house built on sand. The Grandmaster sat in silence for a long time, processing words that challenged 400 years of assumptions. I have been wrong, Solarix finally said. About everything, about the sword, about mastery, about what it means to truly understand something. Ji-hoon nodded slowly. Being wrong is the first step toward being right, he said. Solarix looked up and met his eyes with something new in crystalline depths. Something that might have been hunger or might have been desperation. Will you teach me? The Grandmaster asked. And the words cost more than anything the ancient warrior had ever spoken. Will you show me what true mastery looks like? Ji-hoon studied the defeated champion for a long moment, reading the sincerity and the pain and the genuine desire to understand. Teaching you will mean forgetting everything you think you know, he said. It will mean starting over as if the last 400 years never happened. It will mean humbling yourself before basics that you mastered as a child and treating them as if you have never seen them before. Solarix bowed head. I am ready. Ji-hoon stood and walked to where his blade rested on its rack. The same simple steel sword that had ended 4 centuries of pride. There is one thing I must know first, he said. Solarix looked up. Ask. Why do you want to learn? Ji-hoon said. Is it to restore your pride? To recover what you lost? To prove that you can defeat me someday? Or is it something else? The Grandmaster was silent for a long time. I want to learn, Solarix finally said. Because for 400 years I thought I understood the sword, and now I see that I understood nothing. And I cannot spend another 400 years living in that ignorance. Ji nodded slowly and lifted the blade from its rack. Then we begin, he said. But not with this sword. He set the blade aside and picked up a simple wooden practice sword from a corner of the room. We begin with this, he said. And with the first cut that my grandfather taught me when I was 6 years old, Solarix warned. The greatest blade master in Thalassian history, took the wooden sword in remaining primary hand and held it awkwardly, like a child holding a blade for the first time. Show me, the ancient warrior said, and Kang Ji-hoon, human, 43 years old, began to teach. Raise the blade above your head, he said. and bring it down in a straight line, and do not think about anything else except making that cut perfect. The lesson had begun, and somewhere in the vastness of the galaxy, a species that had practiced the sword for 12,000 years started to learn what it truly meant to hold a blade. Crystalline blood pooled on the arena floor, catching the light and scattering it into 1,000 tiny rainbows. And the silence that hung over the crowd was heavier than any sound could have been. No one had wounded Grandmaster Solarix. Born in over 200 years, no one had even come close, and now a human. A member of a species that the Thalassians considered barely worthy of notice, had taken the Grandmaster's primary sword arm with a single clean cut. In the diplomatic section, Ambassador Yun Sira had risen to her feet without realizing she had moved, and her hands were pressed over her mouth, and tears were streaming down her face, though whether from fear or hope she could not have said. Solarix looked down at the severed limb lying on the stone floor and felt something break inside. Some wall that had been built over centuries of triumph and praise, and the certainty of superiority. The Grandmaster had never tasted defeat, had never even imagined what it might feel like, and now here it was. Cold and sharp and real as the pain that screamed from the stump of a lost arm. But this was the right of blades. Fought to incapacitation or death, and first blood was not enough to end it. Solarix still had 3 arms, still held 3 ancestral blades, and the Grandmaster was not yet ready to yield. The ancient warrior straightened and adjusted stance to compensate for the missing limb, and the 3 remaining blades came up in a defensive pattern that had been designed for exactly this situation. The Thalassian warriors trained for the possibility of losing limbs in combat, and Solarix had spent decades mastering techniques that could be performed with any combination of remaining arms. "I underestimated you," Solarix said, and there was no mockery in the words, now only grim acknowledgement. "That will not happen again." Ji-hoon inclined his head slightly but said nothing. The duel resumed, but everything had changed. The patterns that Solarix used were still beautiful and deadly, but they were no longer perfect, and the confidence that had powered 400 years of victory was gone, replaced by something that looked very much like desperation. Ji-hoon continued his patient evasion, slipping between the blades with the same minimal movements he had used before. But now he added small attacks of his own, a cut across the wrist of the secondary left arm that made Solarix hiss with pain but did not disable the limb, a shallow slice along the thigh that left a trail of crystalline blood but did not hamper movement, a nick on the shoulder that stung but caused no real damage. Each wound was precise and deliberate, and each one carried a message that the watching Thalassians began to understand with growing horror. The human was not trying to kill, he was teaching. Every wound corresponded to a flaw in Solarix's technique, a gap in defense that had gone unnoticed for centuries because no opponent had ever lived long enough to exploit it. The greatest blade master in Thalassian history was being shown, in front of the entire galaxy, that 400 years of practice had not been enough to master the fundamentals. Solarix felt the realization settle into bones like ice, and panic began to override centuries of training and discipline. The attacks became wilder, faster, more desperate, as the Grandmaster threw technique aside and simply tried to land any blow at all on this human who moved like smoke. Ji-hoon sidestepped a thrust that would have impaled a slower opponent and opened a cut across Solarix's ribs as he passed. "Your people learn to fight with 4 arms," Ji-hoon said, and his voice was calm and steady, as if he were discussing the weather rather than fighting for his life. "So you develop techniques for 4 arms." Solarix spun and slashed with all 3 remaining blades, and Ji-hoon ducked beneath the arc and left another shallow cut on the Grandmaster's hip. "You never learned what comes before technique," Ji-hoon continued. "You never learned to be still, to wait, to see." The words cut deeper than the blade, And Solarix roared with fury and launched a final desperate assault that put everything remaining into one overwhelming attack. Ji-hoon moved through it like a dancer performing a routine he had practiced 10,000 times. And when he emerged on the other side, Solarix had 3 more wounds that bled crystalline light onto the arena floor. "You trained for thousands of years," Ji-hoon said. "But you trained to add more techniques, more patterns, more complexity. And you never stopped to ask whether you had truly mastered the simple things." Solarix could barely stand now, and the 3 blades that had seemed so fearsome minutes ago trembled in hands that were slick with blood. "A child could learn your cuts," the Grandmaster gasped. "I watched you train, and I saw nothing but basics." "Yes," Ji-hoon agreed. "A child could learn them. But could a child perform them perfectly 10,000 times in a row without a single variation? Could a child spend 37 years doing nothing else? Could a child give their entire life to understanding why a cut must fall exactly so and not any other way?" He held up his blade, and the blood that stained it seemed to glow in the arena lights. "I do not know 1,000 techniques," Ji-hoon said. "I know one technique, but I know it completely. And I know it so well that it has become part of my bones and my breath and my heartbeat." Solarix's legs gave out, and the Grandmaster collapsed to one knee, barely keeping upright with one hand braced against the stone floor. The 3 remaining blades clattered from failing grips. "I have studied the sword for 400 years, Solarix whispered. "And I thought that made me a master." Ji-hoon stood over the kneeling warrior with his blade held ready and his eyes calm and patient. "Mastery is not about years," he said. "It is about depth, and you can spend a lifetime learning 10,000 techniques. Or you can spend that same lifetime understanding one technique completely. And at the end of that lifetime, you will discover that the one who went deep has foundations that the one who went wide cannot even imagine." The crowd sat in stunned silence, and even the other Thalassian warriors who had come to watch a human die were quiet with something that might have been shame or might have been wonder. Solarix looked up at a human who stood victorious and felt the weight of 4 centuries pressing down like a physical force. All those years, all those victories, all that pride, and in the end a creature with 2 arms and 43 years of life had shown that it meant nothing. Ji-hoon lowered his blade slightly and spoke in a voice that carried through the silent arena. "Do you yield? Or shall I continue the lesson?" The question hung in the air, and every being in the arena of honor waited for the answer that would decide whether the greatest blade master in Thalassian history would live or die. The arena of honor was filled beyond capacity when the day of the duel arrived, and thousands of spectators from dozens of species packed the galleries that rose in tiers around the circular fighting floor. Thalassians made up the majority of the crowd, their crystalline bones catching the arena lights and filling the air with scattered rainbows. And they had come expecting to witness a swift execution that would remind the galaxy why their people were the undisputed masters of the blade. Other species had come as well, drawn by curiosity or by the rare chance to see Grandmaster Solarix Vorm fight. And among them sat small clusters of humans who watched with tension written on their faces. Ambassador Yoon Sira had been given a seat in the diplomatic section, and she gripped the armrests of her chair so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. The traditional ceremonies began with the sounding of crystal horns that sent pure tones echoing through the arena. And then the announcer called forth the champion's Grandmaster Solarix Vorn entered from the eastern gate. And the Thalassian crowd erupted in thunderous cheering. The ancient warrior moved with fluid grace across the fighting floor, 4 crystalline blades held in 4 steady hands, and each blade was a masterwork that had been forged by the greatest smiths in Thalassian history and passed down through generations of Vorn champions. Solarix wore ceremonial armor that left the forearms free to move but protected the torso and legs with plates of hardened crystal. And the armor gleamed with engravings that told the story of 400 years of victory. The crowd fell silent when Kang Ji-hoon entered from the western gate. He wore no armor. He carried one sword. The blade was simple steel with no decorations or engravings, and the grip was worn smooth by decades of use. And there was nothing about the weapon or the man who held it that seemed worthy of standing on the same floor as a Thalassian Grandmaster. Confused murmurs spread through the crowd, and some Thalassians began to laugh at the sight of this plain human with his single plain blade. The announcer called for silence and recited the terms of the duel in the formal language of the Right of Blades, and both warriors acknowledged that they understood the combat would continue until one of them was dead or incapacitated or yielded. Solaris Vorn raised 4 blades in the traditional salute. Ji-hoon raised his single blade in return. The crystal horn sounded once more, and the duel began. Solaris attacked immediately, closing the distance between them with speed that seemed impossible for a being of such size. And 4 blades came at Ji-hoon in a pattern called the whirlwind of endings that had killed 37 opponents over the centuries. The pattern was designed to overwhelm any defense by attacking from 4 directions at once, and no warrior with only 2 arms had ever survived it. Ji-hoon did not try to block. He stepped to the side. The blades passed through the space where he had been standing a moment before, missing him by centimeters, and Solaris spun to face the human who had somehow avoided death. The crowd went quiet. Solaris attacked again with a different pattern, the crashing waves, which combined sweeping cuts with precise thrusts in a rhythm that was almost impossible to predict. Again, Ji-hoon stepped aside at the last possible moment, moving just enough to avoid the blades and no more. And again, the attack found only empty air. No block, no parry, no attempt to deflect the strikes. Just movement so minimal and precise that it seemed the human knew exactly where each blade would be. The foreigner arrived. The Grandmaster felt the first real stirring of concern and pushed it aside to focus on the fight. For the next several minutes, Solaris unleashed technique after technique from 400 years of accumulated knowledge, patterns that have been developed to counter every known fighting style in the galaxy. And each one failed to touch the human who danced between the blades like water flowing around stones. The crowd had gone completely silent. The Thalassian warriors who had laughed at Ji-hoon's training sessions now watched with wide eyes as their greatest champion failed again and again to land a single cut on an opponent with one sword who had not even attempted to attack. Ji-hoon moved with an economy of motion that was almost unsettling to watch. Each step placed exactly where it needed to be. Each shift of weight calculated to require the minimum possible energy. And his eyes never left the center of his opponent's chest where he could read the movements of all 4 arms at once. He was not fighting like a warrior. He was fighting like a man who had spent 37 years learning to be exactly where he needed to be and nowhere else. Solaris began to understand what was happening, and the understanding brought something the Grandmaster had not felt in 2 centuries. Fear. The human was not defending because he did not need to defend, and he was not attacking because he was waiting for something. And that patience was more terrifying than any display of skill or aggression could ever be. "You are very fast," Solaris said between exchanges. "Faster than I expected from a human." Ji-hoon did not respond. "But speed alone will not win this duel," the Grandmaster continued, trying to provoke a reaction that might create an opening. "Eventually you will tire, and when you do, my blades will find you." Ji-hoon remained silent and continued his patient evasion. Solarix felt anger rising alongside the fear and used that anger to fuel a new assault. The Tempest of 1,000 Cuts, which was the most demanding technique in all of Thalassian sword arts, and which the Grandmaster had only used 3 times in 400 years. 4 blades became a blur of motion that filled the air around Ji-hoon with gleaming death, and the human moved through the storm like a ghost, never quite where the blades expected him to be, always one step ahead of the pattern. And then Solarix made a mistake. 400 years of victory had created certain habits, certain assumptions about how combat worked and what opponents would do. And one of those assumptions was that a single sword fighter would eventually have to defend rather than evade. Solarix committed to a thrust with the primary right hand, putting the full weight and power of the attack behind a killing stroke aimed at the human's heart. It was a strike that had ended dozens of duels, but Ji-hoon was not where the blade expected him to be. He had stepped inside the arc of the thrust and his own blade was already moving. A single rising cut that came from below with all the precision of 37 years of daily practice. The steel edge passed through the crystalline flesh of Solarix's primary sword arm, just above the elbow. Severing it cleanly, the crowd gasped as one. The arm fell to the arena floor, still clutching its ancestral blade, and crystalline blood that sparkled like liquid starlight sprayed across the stone. Grandmaster Solarix Vorn stumbled backward, clutching the stump where an arm had been only a moment before. And for the first time in 400 years, the greatest blade master in Thalassian history looked into the eyes of an opponent and saw his own death waiting there. Ji-hoon stood with his blade held ready, blood dripping from the steel, and his face showed no triumph and no excitement, only patience, only the certainty of a man who had resolved to cut and would continue cutting until the work was done. News of the duel spread across the Valorian citadel like fire through dry grass, and within hours, every species on the station knew that a human had challenged the greatest Thalassian blade master to single combat. Most reactions fell somewhere between pity and dark amusement. The Kathrani traders who sold goods in the lower markets made jokes about humans being too stupid to know when they were already dead. And the Morvathi diplomats shook their massive heads and spoke of the tragedy of youth and foolishness. And even the other human staff members on the station looked at Ji-hoon like he had already become a ghost. The arena of honor sat at the heart of the citadel, a vast coliseum of crystal and steel where disputes between species had been settled for thousands of years. And beneath it lay the preparation chambers where warriors could train before their matches. Ji-hoon had been given access to one of these chambers, and he used every hour of his 3 days to prepare. Thalassian warriors gathered in the observation galleries above his training room, and they came in groups of 5 or 10 or 22. Watch the human who had been foolish enough to invoke the right of blades against their greatest champion. What they saw confused them at first, and then amused them. Ji-hoon stood in the center of the room, with a single steel blade in his hands, and he performed the same movements over and over again without variation or flourish. He would raise the sword above his head and bring it down in a straight cut, and then he would step forward and cut again. And then he would step back and return to his starting position. And then he would do it all again. The Thalassians practiced with 4 blades, moving in complex patterns that traced geometric shapes in the air. And their training sessions were displays of speed and coordination that dazzled the eye and overwhelmed the senses. This human did none of that. He simply cut, and stepped, and cut, and stepped, in an endless cycle that seemed more like meditation than combat training. Look at him, one young Thalassian warrior said to his companions. He knows only one technique, and it is a technique that a Thalassian child would master in their first year of training. Perhaps this is all humans are capable of, another replied. They are simple creatures after all, and we should not expect complexity from such limited minds. The laughter spread through the observation gallery. And more. Thalassians came to witness the sad spectacle of a doomed human preparing for death. But there was one observer who did not laugh. Grandmaster Solarix Vorn stood in the shadows at the far end of the gallery. And the ancient warrior watched the human, with eyes that had seen 10,000 duels. Across 4 centuries of life, at first Solarix felt only the mild curiosity of a master watching a student struggle with basics. That should have been abandoned long ago. But as the hours passed and the human continued his endless repetition, something began to nag at the Grandmaster's mind. The human never tired. His arms did not shake with fatigue, and his breathing did not grow ragged, and his focus did not waver even after hours of the same motion repeated thousands of times, and more than that. Each cut was exactly the same as the one before it. Solarix had trained countless students over the centuries, and even the most talented among them showed small variations in their technique, tiny imperfections that revealed themselves over long practice sessions. But this human cut with a precision that bordered on mechanical. It was not impressive technique, but it was perfect technique within its limited scope. Solarix left the observation gallery with a small crease of thought forming between crystalline brows in the human quarters. On the far side of the station, Ambassador Yoon Sarah sat across from Ji-hoon in his small cabin and tried once again to convince him to withdraw from the duel. There must be another way, she said with desperation creeping into her voice. We can offer formal apologies. We can pay reparations. We can find some diplomatic solution that does not end with you being cut to pieces in front of the entire galaxy. Ji-hoon continued to sharpen his blade with slow, careful strokes as he listened to her words. The right cannot be withdrawn once invoked, he said. You know this as well as I do. Then let someone else fight, Yoon said. We can request a champion of our own, perhaps one of the Morvathi warriors who owe us favors. Or we can hire a mercenary from one of the outer systems. Ji-hoon looked up from his blade and met her eyes with calm certainty. The insult was to you, he said, and you are under my protection. And this is my duty to fulfill. Yoon slammed her palm against the table in frustration. Duty. She repeated the word like a curse. Your duty is to protect me, not to die for my honor in some barbaric ritual. I do not intend to die, Ji-hoon said simply. Yoon stared at him for a long moment and then shook her head. He has 4 arms, she said. He's been fighting with blades for 400 years. He has never lost a single duel. And you think you can beat him with one sword and whatever training you picked up on Earth? Ji-hoon set down his sharpening stone and held up his blade to examine the edge in the light. I began training in the sword when I was 6 years old, he said. My grandfather taught me, and his father taught him. And our family has practiced the same style for over 500 years. That is impressive by human standards, Yoon said. But it means nothing against the Thalassian. I am 43 years old now. Ji-hoon continued as if she had not spoken. And in 37 years, I have practiced the same fundamental cuts every single day without exception. And I have done this in heat and in cold and in sickness and in health and on days when I wanted nothing more than to rest. He looked at her with eyes that held no fear and no doubt. The sword does not care how many arms hold it, he said. It only cares whether the one who swings it has resolved to cut. The words hung in the air between them, and Yoon found she had no response in the shadows of a nearby corridor. Grandmaster Solarix Vorn stood perfectly still and listened to every word. The ancient warrior had come to visit the human on a whim, perhaps to offer the traditional courtesy of honoring a dead man with conversation before the duel. But instead, Solarix found something unexpected. The human was not afraid, not brave in the face of fear, not hiding terror behind a mask of calm, but genuinely and completely without fear. Solarix had faced many opponents over the centuries who claimed to be unafraid. And they had all been lying to themselves or to others. But this human spoke truth that came from somewhere deep and certain, for the first time in 200 years. Grandmaster Celeric Vorn felt a small cold whisper of unease. That night Celeric could not sleep. And instead the Grandmaster sat in meditation and reviewed 400 years of combat experience, searching for any memory of an opponent who had carried themselves the way this human did. There was none. When dawn came, Celeric rose and walked to the arena of honor and began to prepare for a duel that no longer felt like the simple execution it had seemed 3 days ago. Kang Ji-hoon stood 3 steps behind Ambassador Yoon Sira as she walked through the crystalline corridors of the Valorian citadel, and he kept his eyes moving across every shadow and doorway they passed. The space station was massive beyond anything humans had built. A sprawling complex of towers and domes that floated in neutral space where no single species could claim authority. And it served as the meeting ground for civilizations that had sailed between stars while humans were still learning to make fire. Ji-hoon had been a diplomatic security officer for 12 years now, and he had seen many alien species in that time. But the Thalassians made him uneasy in a way he could not fully explain. They were tall, standing nearly 3 meters in height, with forearms that ended in hands of surprising delicacy. And their bones were made of something that looked like living crystal that caught the light and scattered it in rainbow patterns beneath their pale skin. Every Thalassian they passed wore blades at their hips. Not 1 or 2, but 4. And each blade was a work of art that had been passed down through countless generations. Ambassador Yoon had briefed him before they arrived, and what she told him painted a clear picture of who they were dealing with. The Thalassians had built their entire civilization around the sword, and they had been practicing their blade arts for over 12,000 years. And in all that time, no other species had ever matched them in single combat. They believed that the sword was the purest expression of a warrior's soul, and they looked down on species that relied on guns and bombs and other weapons that killed. From a distance, humans fell firmly into that category of lesser beings in Thalassian eyes. The negotiation chamber was a vast circular room with a dome ceiling that showed the stars outside, and Thalassian trade lords sat in a crescent formation on one side while the human delegation took their places on the other. Ji-hoon positioned himself at the edge of the room where he could watch both his people and the aliens, and he noticed that several Thalassian warriors had done the same thing on their side. The talks were about trade routes and mining rights in a sector of space that both species wanted to develop. And for the first 2 hours, everything proceeded with careful politeness. Then a Thalassian named Vareth Kell leaned forward in his seat and spoke words that changed everything. "I find it amusing," Vareth said in a voice that carried across the chamber, "that these soft creatures think they can negotiate as equals with the Thalassian Empire." Ambassador Yoon did not react to the insult, and her face remained calm and professional as she continued to review the documents in front of her. "We have been sailing between stars for 10,000 years," Voreth continued, "and in that time we have conquered 17 species and brought them into our empire as servants and laborers. And we did this not with ships or bombs, but with blades in hand and courage in our hearts." Ji-hoon felt his muscles tense, but he kept his position and his silence. "Humans are soft prey animals," Voreth said with a cruel smile spreading across his angular face. "And they learn to build weapons only because they lack the body to fight. And they hide behind their machines because they know that in honest combat, they would fall like grain before the harvest blade." Ambassador Yoon finally looked up from her documents and met Voreth's gaze with steady eyes. "The Thalassian Empire's martial tradition is well known and respected," she said in an even tone, "and humanity seeks only fair trade arrangements that benefit both our peoples." Voreth stood from his seat and walked toward the human delegation with slow, deliberate steps. And every Thalassian warrior in the room placed hands on their sword hilts. Respected. Vorath repeated the word like it tasted bad in his mouth. You cannot respect what you do not understand. And you cannot understand the way of the blade when your species has spent its entire existence running from predators and throwing rocks from a safe distance. He stopped in front of Ambassador Yoon and looked down at her with contempt burning in his crystalline eyes. Your people are not warriors, he said. They are clever animals who learn to make tools. And nothing more. Ambassador Yoon held her composure even as Vorath reached down and seized the ceremonial sash that crossed her shoulder, a symbol of her authority as a representative of Earth. And he tore it from her body and threw it to the ground. The chamber went silent. Ji-hoon understood what had just happened, even though he was not an expert on Thalassian customs. And from the shocked faces of the other Thalassian trade lords, he could see that Vorath had crossed a serious line, but he also knew that in Thalassian culture such an insult could only be answered. In one way, he stepped forward before anyone else could speak. I invoked the right of blades, Jim said in a clear voice that carried through the chamber. Vorath turned to look at him with surprise, and then amusement spreading across his features. The human speaks, Vorath said. Does it even know what words it uses? I am Kan Ji-hoon, he replied, security officer to Ambassador Yoon Sira of Earth. And by Thalassian law, I have the right to answer an insult to my charge with steel. And I invoke that right now. The Thalassian trade lords began speaking rapidly among themselves, and Ji-hoon caught words about tradition and honor and the proper forms that must be observed. Vorath laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the crystal walls. You wish to fight me, little human, he said with mockery dripping from every word. The right was invoked against the insult, Ji-hoon said. And Thalassian tradition allows the challenged party to name a champion. And I expect you will not face me yourself. Vorath's smile faltered for just a moment before it returned. Even wider than before. Clever animal indeed, he said. Very well, I name my champion, and I choose the greatest blade master the Thalassian Empire has ever produced. He turned to a figure standing in the shadows, at the edge of the chamber. A tall Thalassian, whose crystalline bones seemed to glow with an inner light. Grandmaster Solarix Vorn, Vorath announced. We'll fight in my place. The name sent whispers racing through the room. And even the Thalassian trade lords seemed surprised by this choice. Solarix Vorn stepped into the light, and Ji-hoon studied his opponent carefully. The Grandmaster was old by Thalassian standards, with a face marked by centuries of battle and forearms that moved with the fluid grace of a master who had long since transcended mere technique. I accept, Solarix said in a voice that was soft but carried absolute certainty. It has been many years since I faced a new species in the arena, and though this will not be a challenge, it will at least be a curiosity. The duel will take place in 3 standard days, announced the senior trade lord. In the arena of honor, as tradition demands. Solarix Vorn looked at Ji-hoon with eyes that held no anger and no excitement. Only a calm assessment, like a craftsman examining a piece of raw material. 3 days, Solarix said. That should be enough time for you to make peace with whatever gods your people pray to, and to prepare whatever funeral rites your culture observes. Ji-hoon met the Grandmaster's gaze without flinching. 3 days will be sufficient, he said. The Thalassians filed out of the chamber, and Ambassador Yoon turned to Ji-hoon with fear and guilt warring on her face. What have you done? She whispered. My duty, Ji-hoon answered. Nothing more and nothing less. And in the back of his mind, he began to count the hours until he would face 400 years of mastery with nothing but a single blade, and 37 years of practice.